All right, we are back with our next episode of About Crypto, and we have a buddy of mine, Jon Reynolds, who works at Moonpay. How's it going, John?
Good, good. Thanks for having me, Cody. Always excited to get involved and talk to people, until we can meet people in person. This is the best we can do.
Yeah, absolutely, man, and hopefully that's pretty soon. So I guess we'll find out, right?
Yeah.
And so, how did you get into crypto?
Yeah. So it was one of those things where you hear about it over the years when you're in college, you're doing stuff with friends and people are like, oh, well, how can we get X, Y, or Z? Like I've heard, there's ways of transacting online. And so I sort of heard about it, but I never understood it. That would probably be around like 2013, 2014. Never looked into it. And then in mid 2017, a friend of mine who was also one of my partners in consulting, he basically came to me and said, hey, there's a group of investors that I'm friends with, and they basically are looking for somebody to do a deep dive on Bitcoin and Ethereum, and determine if it's worth, if it's a good bet basically to invest money into it at this point, with a timeline of 1 to 2 years. So having traded in equities and forex for almost 10 years at that point. I looked into it, looked into the market structure, started with all the technical analysis, and it looked pretty strong. But as the months went on of really diving in and talking to people, it became clear that as the price just kept going up and up and up, and looking at the prior historical bubbles, it's like this is not going to last long. And in a year or two, it's probably going to be lower than it is now. But yeah, so I basically looked into Ethereum and Bitcoin, but once I realized this is not good, I gave them the advice. The market crashed. It was pretty serendipitous. And then they basically said, well, we'd like you to continue and look into what sort of ERC20 tokens can do, and other Ethereum platform protocols that enable sort of an additional layer of programmable value, or smart contracts, or non-fungible tokens. And so I looked into those, and some insane concepts: sand coin, banana coin, water coin, things that in theory, like if you don't know anything about cryptocurrencies, but that it's like a ledger or a database or something, and someone says sand coin or banana coin, it's like, oh, okay, like that might be real. But looking more into it, it's like very clearly not even alpha software that has no real world implementation, and the team that raised the money like is very hard to get in contact with. Um, so after that, I basically realized, I have to do better. I have to learn more, and I have to do it faster than I've ever done it before. So I actually made a meetup group, because when I moved back from Los Angeles to Connecticut, I searched, Greenwich crypto, and there was nothing. And I was like, oh, how much does it cost to make a meetup group? And it was free. So I did it. In the first 2 weeks, we had like 5 people join. And I was like, okay, like this is good. We had 2 people who I'm still friends with, that I've worked on a few projects with, Michael Kachowski of Bath Leads and Roger Benitez of Blockhive Technologies. They were the first 2 people and the only 2 people to show up to that first meetup, and we shared a beer and we had a great conversation. And we've been going for about a year and a half, and I think we're about to break 250 members. So we're still doing digital stuff. And I actually, through that group, that's actually how I got my job at Moonpay.
Nice. Yeah, so I'd love to hear what you're working on via Moonpay.
Sure. Yeah. So I was, in trying to find a job that I really wanted to stay with and really develop a career with, it was important for me to find a company that was still growing, that would be, open to sort of changing your role and wearing a lot of hats at once, because that was something I was really familiar with as a consultant. And basically, I had a few people who were tagging me in jobs on LinkedIn, and one of them was for Moonpay. I sent them an email, sent them a resume, cover letter, and they got back to me, interviewed. It was a great interview process. And they basically said, your customer service skills and your data acumen are really what we'd like to work with you on. And so for the first 3 weeks, which I said earlier is ending tomorrow, first 3 weeks. So still very early, but a whirlwind. I'm working on basically helping scale the customer service experience, helping to automate a lot of the stuff that can be automated while still having a personal touch on it, so that you still get that sense that you're talking to a real person. Even if the real person is, using a lot of automated systems, there is still somebody who is able to solve your problem if you need help. And so one of the main things is basically, looking out for fraud. So reviewing transactions, getting familiar with sort of the landscape of the different signifiers that you have for whether a transaction is legitimate or fraudulent. And then basically working with the more technical engineer people to figure out how can we build a system that will enable us to scale to 1 billion customers and still retain the same fraud rates that we have currently, which are improving and always getting better. But as you employ certain systems like the ACH system, competitors / partners of ours have done that, and they have had debilitating amounts of fraud. Like they literally had to remove access to ACH as a payment on-ramp because of the amount of fraud. So
Wow.
there's a lot of things that go into it. But we are partnering with people who are providing great software as a service, and we are also developing our own IP in order to combat that, ever-present threat of fraud.
Yeah, that must be definitely very tough, especially in this space. You have so many ways
Yeah.
to
And
mix
it's
and
24/7, 365. So
all over the world.
yeah, literally. I mean, we have a guy in Vietnam. We have people in the UK. We have people in Poland. We have people in where is it? Is it Idaho? I think Idaho and DC and Connecticut, New York. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot. It's definitely the first time I've ever worked on a fully remote team that is international, that is in a market that is 24/7.
Yeah,
So it's a big learning curve, but I'm pretty sure I've had steeper learning curves, and you're not always compensated for some of those other learning curves. So I'm feeling pretty good, and the team's great. So I'm very excited to be there.
that's great, man. Good for you. It sounds like you're happy and doing what you want to do, which is awesome.
Yeah,
So,
it's definitely something I am grateful for, especially in a time like this where there's so much uncertainty. It's crazy.
yeah, that's for sure, man. And do you think at some point crypto will see like mainstream adoption, or is it going to take a while?
I mean, it really depends. A lot of people have, there's sort of a lot of schools of thought, right? I mean, you have the libertarians who believe that, it has to happen just because of the theory of sound money. That's a flawed theory for a number of reasons that I'm not well versed in enough to really, go in on. But there's other things that are more valuable. The most concerning thing to me is actually there was a thing that the Department of Defense released. Did you see this? The Forbes article that basically said the Department of Defense has war gamed the scenario of the Black Lives Matter using Bitcoin
Yeah,
as insurrection currency, basically.
yeah, that's
That's
pretty wild.
that's like a real end game scenario that people, cypherpunks and everything, have like thought of before. So the fact that like the Department of Defense is like on that definitely, is a step in the step function in terms of recognition. The other big player, two big players would be, obviously the Libra Association and then the Chinese Communist Party. So, wherever it happens first, once it happens and it doesn't break, then that's another step in the step function. And then once Facebook basically successfully courts the central banks to offset a lot of their risk in the reserves, and they basically say to the central banks, you control all this stuff, we're just giving you the payment rails basically. It's gonna happen. I do think it's gonna happen, especially because there's Ray Dalio has a great book on debt crises, and one of the main points in the book is that currency historically really has only lasted for about like 50 to 75 years in one form. And so if you go back to, I think it was like the mid 60s, when Nixon took us off the gold standard. I'm really bad with US history, working on it, but basically you start the timeline from when they took us off the gold standard, and I think it's about 60 years. So we're like right in that area of massive structural change in how our currency works. So I do think it's inevitability. Whether China does it first, China will probably do it first, just because it's the most centralized entity in the world. And they'll probably do really well with it, honestly, because that's like the primary use case is total control.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it is what it is.
yeah, it just is what it is at that point. Well, thanks again for coming on. You have so much knowledge in so many areas. And where can people find you?
Sure. Yeah. So physically, I'm still social distancing. So I'm trying to limit that. But I am on Twitter. I always have to check my screen name because I've changed it a few times. But I think it's _J Reynolds 999. Or just email Jon, Jon, at moonpay.io. So either of those would be great. I just broke 100 followers on Twitter. Very excited.
This is it, man. You're on the way up, dude.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it's like you start to try and mine as much dopamine as you can from these things. It's like, how can I really fulfill my ego? And it's like, oh, well, I have like 4 or 5 followers who have over like 50,000 followers. So I sort of have that many followers, right? No.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's definitely the same thing.
Yeah, so I don't know. That's sort of how I'm ranking myself. But I did like your feedback about just post every day. It was funny because the one Saturday, I actually scheduled that on Friday. And I was like, all right, I got my Saturday post. And then I haven't scheduled anything else. And I was wondering, do you schedule some tweets or do you just tell everybody when you're getting coffee?
I really just tell everybody, like, straight up. Whatever comes to mind, I put it out there. And if it's taken pretty bad, I usually just leave it up. Because why not, right?
Yeah, unless it's like the type of thing that will inhibit your presidential campaign in like 30 years when the ultra progressive.
Oh, I'm screwed. Yeah, I'm already out at that point.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I mean, I had a conversation with my grandparents and my dad last night about the protests, and like, people just don't get it. And in 50 years, we're not going to get it. And that's just how it is. Like, that's life. That's history.
Absolutely, man. Well, thanks again for coming on, and you're the man. So we're going to wrap it up right here.
Thank you.
Everybody,
always good to talk with you, Cody.
All right.